Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Daniel Thomas Hind. We have breaking news in the world of literature, this time coming from Hollywood, California. I have just received a report that acclaimed novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald was found dead in a West Hollywood apartment due to an apparent heart attack. He was 44. F. Scott Fitzgerald's story is quite the tragic tale, not solely because of his battles with alcoholism or his tumultuous marriage with one Zelda Fitzgerald, formerly Sayer of the wealthy Southern stock. No, Fitzgerald dies a tragic hero because, as bizarre as this might sound to viewers in the 21st century, the famed author never quite realized his true potential as a writer. His perennial popularity and book sales were largely realized after his death, which we will cover later in this program. F. Scott did reach celebrity status during the Roaring Twenties, with novels This Side of Paradise and The Great Gatsby, and short stories like The Diamond as Big as the Ritz, regularly published in the Saturday Evening Post, making him a household name. But he simply could not capitalize on the commercial success. His slew of bad behaviors, accompanied by excess socializing and extensive traveling, constant marital issues, and generally living above his means, took a toll on the author and compromised his writing. Tonight, a special broadcast on the self-destructive rise and fall of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Tyler Patrick Jones with more.
The backdrop of this author's life is, of course, the Jazz Age, an era popularly characterized by extravagant parties, hedonism to the absurd, sexual liberation, explosive artistic expression, and an ignorance to the horrors that lay waiting in the future. Born on September 24th, 1896 in St. Paul, Minnesota, Fitzgerald had a somewhat privileged upbringing in his middle-class family before attending the Newman School in New Jersey and later Princeton University. His experiences at both institutions having influenced his protagonist, Amory Blaine, in his debut novel, This Side of Paradise. Despite his reaching for the stars, Fitzgerald's Midwestern upbringing in St. Paul had a lasting influence on his outlook and work, namely, a lifelong obsession with the rich and wealthy, developing something of an inferiority complex which he wrote about extensively in his second novel, The Beautiful and Damned, among other works. Fitzgerald broke out onto the scene in 1920 with the aforementioned This Side of Paradise, having captured the spirit of the post-war generation, earning him immediate fame. It was a glimpse into the lives of the young and disillusioned, a generation quite similar to today, and it resonated with many of his contemporaries. As the decade roared on, Fitzgerald became a fixture of the Jazz Age, and his expatriate gang living in Paris described as the Lost Generation by Gertrude Stein, where he befriended Stein and the likes of Ernest Hemingway, John Dos Passos, Sylvia Beach, Paul and Sarah Murphy, as well as James Joyce. His most famous work, The Great Gatsby, published in 1925, painted a vivid portrait of the Jazz Age in East Coast America, particularly New York, and a compelling portrait of the opulence, decadence, and moral decay of the time. Yet, despite its eventual acclaim, it only sold around 20,000 copies in the 1920s, which was considered modest and rather disappointing by the standards of the time. Looking at the author's life and what would come next, one might conclude that this disappointment is something from which Fitzgerald never recovered. Back to you, Daniel.
A quote by Ernest Hemingway. His talent was as natural as the pattern that was made by the dust on a butterfly's wings. At one time, he understood it no more than the butterfly did, and he did not know when it was brushed or marred. Later, he became conscious of his damaged wings and of their construction, and he learned to think and could not fly anymore because the love of flight was gone, and he could only remember when it had been effortless. In The Crack-Up, a series of personal essays F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote in 1936, the author reflects deeply on his mental and emotional breakdown, addressing his alcoholism, career decline, and marriage to Zelda Sayer Fitzgerald. Although our program does not have the time to appropriately probe the inner psyche of Mr. Fitzgerald, because you'd scroll away, we can share a few major highlights that contributed to his downfall. His marriage. At the heart of F. Scott Fitzgerald's public life was his complicated marriage to Zelda, a union marked by both passionate love and deep turmoil. Their relationship was a whirlwind, beginning as a romance fueled by the fervor of youth and ambition, but turned upside down by Fitzgerald's dependence on alcohol and Zelda's severe struggles with jealousy, mental health, and institutionalization. Fitzgerald's essays express his deep sense of despair over Zelda's illness and its impact on their marriage. He refers to a growing sense of isolation, both from her and from the world around him, describing a profound emotional collapse where he felt he had lost touch with everything he once held dear, including his marriage. Having consulted Ernest Hemingway, he paints a picture of Zelda as someone deeply jealous, who discouraged Fitzgerald's writing and even mocked his career, which compounded Fitzgerald's struggles. To paraphrase Hemingway, Zelda's erratic behavior and mental instability was at the heart of Scott's decline and the primary reason he wasted his talent, having never established a consistent writing habit. His alcoholism. Hemingway, again in his Paris book, A Movable Feast, has much to say about Fitzgerald and his drinking habits. He describes Fitzgerald as a man who drank excessively, often to the point of incapacitation. Hemingway describes how alcohol affected Fitzgerald's appearance, describing him as looking pale, weak, and physically diminished, particularly during their time in Paris. This was a sharp contrast to the charming and charismatic figure Fitzgerald had been earlier in his life. Fitzgerald candidly addresses his alcoholism in The Crack Up, linking his drinking to his emotional exhaustion and the sense that his personal and professional life had unraveled. He admits to using alcohol as a way to cope with feelings of failure, particularly after his literary success had faded and he had struggled financially. To paraphrase, Fitzgerald writes how alcohol had at times numbed his pain and blurred the sharp edges of his disappointments. He describes periods where he felt detached from his own life, and alcohol played a significant role in exacerbating this sense of fragmentation. His tone in the essays is one of regret and disillusionment. In the essays, Fitzgerald reflects on his perception of himself as a failure, not only as a writer, but as a husband and a man. He doesn't place all the blame on his drinking or his marriage to Zelda, but rather on the culmination of pressures: his literary decline, his financial pressures, his disillusionment with fame, and his personal relationships. Indeed, in the 1930s, he only wrote one more novel, Tender as the Night, in 1934, considered one of Fitzgerald's most complex works, deeply influenced by his marriage to Zelda and her struggles with mental illness. The first half of the book is this reporter's favorite of his works. Fitzgerald ended up in Los Angeles in 1937, forced to accept a screenwriting offer by MGM, only writing a handful of short scenes and dialogue punch-ups, all uncredited. Though he tried to turn his life around, and according to his girlfriend, Sheila Graham, a British-born gossip columnist, had gotten sober. But his failure in Hollywood was a sour end to such a complex life. Days before his death, Fitzgerald suffered dizzying spells and heart complications, ending with him collapsing on the floor, dying without a word while lying on his back. He left behind his daughter, Scotty, and an unfinished novel, The Last Tycoon, published posthumously in 1941. As we remember the passing of F. Scott Fitzgerald, let us also recognize the importance of seeking help, breaking the cycle, and finding healthier outlets for our struggles. It wasn't until after World War II, particularly in the 1940s and 50s, that The Great Gatsby began to gain widespread popularity, eventually becoming a staple in American literature in both high school and college classrooms. Today, Gatsby is recognized as one of the greatest American novels ever written, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, one of the most celebrated and accomplished authors to have ever graced our minds and hearts. Unfortunately for the author, he never got to experience his great success. A befitting tragedy for this tragic figure. That brings us to the end of this special edition of the Author Alert. Thank you for watching. Good night and good reading.